Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. With me today is Jacob Shapiro. Say hi, Jacob.
Hello. Hi. Sorry, I was supposed to say hi, not hello.
Yeah, yeah, do as I say. And we have Allison Fedorka joining us as well. How's it going, Allison?
Pretty good.
If we play our cards right, we might have a surprise visit from Philip later if he can deign to grace us with his presence. A few weeks ago, I don't remember the exact date, we had a reader write in, and he was asking us what we thought about populism. He wanted to know how we would define populism, and it's a valid question because you see this word just so often in the media, and we invoke it sometimes ourselves. So before we get into some of our other topics, I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on it, and I know it probably means different things in different countries, and we don't espouse any ideology here, but we do comment on a world in which ideology is an important aspect of political identity and things like that. So there is a difference between populism, capital P, and populism, lowercase p. The populist movement was an actual political movement back in, I want to say, the late 1800s, early 1900s. That while these definitions do change, I do think it might be kind of confusing sometimes when we and others mistake populism for progressivism. There are some similarities, but it's not really the same thing at all. So again, I think this isn't just an intellectual argument. I think it's important because if you can apply the word populism to Donald Trump, or if you can apply it to Bernie Sanders, or some of these other upstart, essentially socialist democratic candidates that are running for office in the United States right now, I do feel like it's important to sort of clarify what we mean when we say this. I mean, do you agree?
Well, populism is a difficult concept to think about. You brought up the Populist Party in the United States. The name of that party was actually the People's Party, and it was described as a populist party, and then it sort of became, in colloquial parlance, it became known as the Populist Party because it was reaching out to the people. Now, in that particular case, what was going on in the United States was that farmers were feeling like they were getting screwed, and the populist, or the People's Party in this case, was a group that arose out of that dissatisfaction with the government. They felt like the northern elites and the eastern elites were not actually being sympathetic to what these various farmers in the center of the country actually needed. The problem there, of course, is if that's your definition of populism, then technically the Confederacy is populist, right? Because that was a disagreement between North and South over economic issues, and the South was concerned about the North not respecting the needs of the people. If you want to take it to modern times, the Tea Party and the Republican Party from yesteryears now, it feels like so long ago. Is that technically a populist party? Is the Bernie Sanders movement, like you say, within the Democratic Party also a populist party? It gets very vague. I find that populism is usually a euphemism for some kind of radicalism that you don't want to call radicalism. So a populist party is really just something that has a significant, usually minority of the population that likes it. Usually it's a portion of the population that feels or has been disenfranchised. And that is what it tries to express itself as. So I guess that's my best take at a definition.
To that, I would just say, I think I agree. And to your point, there's definitely a negative connotation surrounding populist as sort of a way to brand something that you don't like, or that one party sees as a fringe element, and that cuts across party lines. I think what else cuts across party lines, that there is a temptation to mistake populism with popular, right? And I know both sides of the aisle does this, but what's the difference between a candidate appealing to a voter base and to do the things that, or to say the things that they want to hear? Isn't that just the nature of representative democracy, right? So populism is often unfairly branded as, oh, this thing that some politician is shamelessly appealing to people who like this certain thing, but that's what they're supposed to do to some degree or another, right?
Yeah, I would say it's what they're supposed to do to some degree or another. I also think about it in terms of how. So we've been talking a lot about how the people are the one end of the spectrum, or the equation, I should say, in terms of dictating the course of where things should go and what causes are important and what needs to be done by the government and things like that. There's also this idea of how the government responds to this. And I remember, for people who don't know, I have a slightly different background than Cole and Jacob. So a lot of my formation with different types of political ideology and even some types of economic thought come a lot from experiences in South America. And I remember a class there where we were talking about Peronismo, and I was not very familiar with it at the time. And the first thing the professor said was, it's not left, it's not right, it's just, it is what it is. And I found that extremely unhelpful at the time, but it did get me thinking. And when I think about populism, like you said, it doesn't necessarily stay on one side of the aisle. It does cross over, and it's not just about representing a group of people, but it's also, I see it as a behavior by a government to stay in power. So you can have them taking action that would normally be termed, either conservative on one end, and then have that same government do something that would be seen as a little bit more liberal on the other, going back and forth, doing whatever it takes for them to stay in power. And they try to stay in power by appeasing the masses or whatever group they are using as their main support, is how I would kind of reconcile a little bit that idea.
I actually think Philip is here now. Philip, are you here now?
I am here now.
Oh, hey, Philip's here. Tell us everything you know about populism. No, let me start over. That's stupid. Let me put the question to you guys differently then. Is it a mistake to think of populism as a political ideology in and of itself?
Yes, I think it's sort of a blank slate, because that can be filled by whatever the hot button issues are, or whatever the frustrations of the people are at any given time.
Yeah, I mean, when you say populism, you're not actually expressing a particular basket of principles, right? The only thing that really all populists have in common is that they divide society between elites and between the common person, right? And there are the elites who are not listening to you, who are not taking care of you, and then there are the common people, and the populist is the person that wants to represent the common people, wants to use those feelings of disenfranchisement or disillusionment or whatever the case may be, and wants to use those to gain political power. And then once in political power, must give back to those classes. So unlike if you called someone a Marxist, for example, you would know exactly how that person thinks about history, politics, entitlement programs, etc.
Well, let me cut you off there. That kind of dovetails exactly to what I was going to say. While there are some similarly nebulous political terms out there, if I just said right or if I said left, you kind of have a vague notion of what this person might think or what kind of feelings they might espouse. Even without getting into specifics, and even though the left in France is real different from the left in Venezuela, right? There's these differences abound, but you have a general sense of that. I don't think you get that general sense. Populism in modern parlance, I think of as a tool, not as an ideology itself. Well, it's also, now let me be very clear here too. I do not want to draw any unfair comparisons here. But I think a useful analog to me, the way I think of it, and I'm a child of the post 9/11 environment. So this has always been sort of a thing on my mind. I kind of think of it conceptually in the same way as I think of terrorism. Terrorism really doesn't convey a whole lot of meaning in and of itself. And you can be a terrorist and be in the IRA, and you could be a terrorist and you could be in the Muslim Brotherhood, and you could be any number of different things. And some of it's self-identified and some of it's just like slanderous or libelous or things that your enemies want to use to attack you, but doesn't actually convey much in and of itself in terms of like ideological principle, right? But that's not to say that like terrorism is without meaning. When you say terrorism, like I get a pretty good sense of like what somebody means when you say, oh, that is an Irish terrorist, or that is a jihadist. Like I get that is all I'm saying.
Well, just for our listeners right now, if you didn't get that metaphor enough, Cole just compared populism to the political equivalent of terrorism. So now populists and terrorists are the exact same thing.
Yeah, I did not want to be very clear and say I do not believe populists are terrorists at all. Be very clear. In fact, I'm going to say that
at least Al-Qaeda had an ethos.
Yeah, I'm going to say this 300 to 400 more times on this podcast. I do not think populists are terrorists at all. Unequivocally, 100%. Thank you, Jacob.
Yeah, but look, to your point, though, I mean, the issue here is that populism is usually a word that is used in a pejorative context by those who are already in power and those who are trying to, in a sense, delegitimize the political aspirations or desires or feelings of a particular class of the society, right? So at the moment you say that something is populist, you are dealing with a society where there are enough divisions there for somebody to want to create this kind of relationship between those who are lead and those who are not. We could talk about what populism is, but I think we would all pretty much agree on what populism is. For me, the more interesting question is, when does populism sprout up? When that word starts being used, what's happening in that society that people are beginning to think that way? So, for instance, the most famous use of populism in the United States, right, is at the end of the Gilded Age. It's the end of the 1800s. It's the end of Reconstruction. Industrialization has taken off, and you've got Rockefeller and Carnegie and all of these different monopolies and rich people emerging in the United States, and the farmers feel like they've been left behind. The people in the central part of the United States, even in parts of the South, don't even have electricity, and they want their governments to make sure that they have electricity, and that's one of their demands. Populism is again becoming one of those words that people use all the time, in part because I think the divisions inside of society are so strong. And then I guess the second thing that I would throw out there is there populism in a place like China? Is there populism in a place like Russia? Or is populism really something that can only happen within the confines of a kind of democracy that works? The point of a place like Russia, of a place like China, is to make sure that people don't feel that division between a lower class or an upper class. They're never going to define things in that pejorative kind of way because you're opening up a can of worms. It seems to me that populism is really an expression in the West, usually, of some kind of disagreement between two different factions that are vying for political power.
Now, we can talk about that for hours and hours and hours, but I actually wanted to take this opportunity to kind of parlay this into the situation in Mexico, right? So they just got a new president earlier this month, and he's got a lot of names. He goes by many different things. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. I call him AMLO because I'm lazy.
Calls himself AMLO.
Does he really?
Actually,
wow.
I have no idea. Allison, do you know?
The Mexican press refers to him as AMLO.
He has a really long name. It's not.
It's a fault. Very long. Yeah. 4 names, I think, is just probably too many names. Also, I want to go on the record and say populists are not terrorists. I want to refrain that as often as I can throughout this podcast. But for real, let's talk about AMLO for a little bit. Allison, this fits squarely within your wheelhouse. Talk about what his victory means.
So his victory actually illustrates the point that Jacob was talking about during our more theoretical discussion of what is populism and what does it represent and indicate, in that he is very much a reflection of the social undercurrents that were going on in Mexico at the time of his election. So there's 2 things to remember when we think about his election. The first is that he comes from an outsider party. The dominant party in Mexico is called the PRI, and since independence in the 1930s, since their post-revolution, I should say, the PRI has been in charge of the government for 70 plus years. And the second political party, which was really up until a couple of administrations ago, the mainstream opponent to the PRI, called PAN, they won a couple of presidential elections, but that was about it. So in many ways, it was a party, it was very much a country with one party dominating the entire political system. And we're starting to see that crack because we have AMLO and his party, which is called Morena, and he basically founded that as a spin-off party. He didn't like any of the 2 main parties that were in the political system, and he decided to form his own, and it's worked out really well for him. And the second thing to remember is this was his 3rd time running to become president. So he lost the first 2 times, and we are now seeing conditions of of a perfect storm in Mexico where we have that backlash from the general populace that Jacob is referring to, saying, hey, we're underrepresented. Hey, we have these major problems that we need fixed. We are going to be rejecting what we see as the elites. We are rejecting what we see as the traditional establishment. And that really explains this rise to power of AMLO that has been in the making for, the past 12 years, ever since he tried running the first time.
So it's early into his presidency yet. What differences exist between him and his predecessor?
So it's hard to see exactly what he's going to do. I believe Philip earlier said, it's hard to see exactly which way he's going to go because he's got a coalition that is very broad. It's on both sides of the spectrum. And so it's not a very clear, cohesive group of people other than the fact that they support AMLO. And the other issue is that he's basically just said he wants to do everything differently. He's trying to reduce the footprint of the military, both in terms of domestic security, but also kind of confining it a little bit more in terms of its role in the government as well. He's looking at austerity packages that he thinks are going to be important for the Mexican government and their finances going down the road. He's looking to take a completely new turn with security and fighting organized crime by looking at different options that have been seen as controversial, like legalizing drugs or even trying to negotiate settlements with different cartel groups. And then a few other things where it's not necessarily reflective of him or his party, but of the needs of Mexico in the future, such as trying to improve Mexico's refining capacity so they don't have to import nearly as much gasoline from the United States, trying to diversify its foreign policy so that they are not as vulnerable to the United States. So there's certain things where he's taking a very distinct approach to his predecessor. And then there are some other national interest areas that he's doing that I think would be somewhat similar for anybody that took the office, just because it is very clear what Mexico needs and that needs to be pursued.
And what does Mexico need?
The refining capacity, improving that, diversifying its trade away from the United States, dealing with the domestic. Yeah.
To put a finer point on that question, what does Mexico need? Like what specifically can Mexico do? Most countries want to diversify their trading partners to the extent that they can. Most want to be able to produce some sort of indigenous energy industry. What kind of options are available, if any?
Cole, I think the answer that I would posit to your question is this. Countries are capable of lots of things if you can harness collective willpower to move in a particular direction. The problem with Mexico is that corruption levels and the war against the cartels and the way that the drug wars have really decimated parts of Mexican society mean that any leader of Mexico was already going to have a difficult time in order to try and move Mexico in another direction. But we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought that power in Mexico currently resides in the office of the presidency. It doesn't. Maybe even less so than countries like the United States or elsewhere, where the head of government may actually be able to do something or move a country in a different policy direction if they want. The president of Mexico, whether it's going to be somebody like Obrador, whether it was going to be somebody like Peña Nieto, the problem that Mexico faces is that the head of government really is not in control of the entire country. You have vigilante groups that are sprouting up all over the place to defend themselves because they can't trust the police. Even the cartels, which are beginning to fracture apart and compete with each other, in part because of the way the drug trade is working, in part because of previous Mexican government attempts to keep them in line, even the stability that a couple large cartels might have supplied, so you know where to go or who the people are that are in control of things, is just not true in Mexico anywhere. You have all these smaller splinter cartels now that are competing for ground, and it's sometimes not clear exactly who's in control on the ground where. So Mexico has all of these problems, overly dependent on the United States. As Allison said, they have issues with making parts of their domestic economy better. Certainly there are issues in Central America that Mexico would like to deal with on a bilateral or on a state-to-state level. Mexico might even have ambitions of being a leader in the Latin American world or in the Spanish-speaking world. It certainly has on paper all of the aspects that it would need. It has a large population, an impressive economy, etc. But what Mexico doesn't have is it doesn't have a functioning country. That may sound a little harsh, and I'm wondering if Allison's going to push back on me about that. But what Obrador needs to do is he has to create some kind of system where Mexico's government is actually in charge of Mexico, because right now Mexico's government is not really in charge of Mexico. I look at Mexico and I see a country that has basically been taken hostage by either poverty, by drug cartels, or by groups that don't feel like the government is looking out for them.
I think this is kind of one advantage of AMLO's populist streak. I mean, he is really a populist in its purest form, pitting the masses against the elites, against the corrupt institutions, against the status quo, but also in just his ability and charisma and willingness to sort of appeal to everybody everywhere whenever he felt it was necessary, even if that meant contradicting himself from one speech to the next, and even if that meant making a bunch of policy pledges that were really vague, short on detail, and if you actually tried to nail them down, it would probably be impossible to implement. He can't implement all of these spending projects and cut off foreign investment and raise taxes and implement austerity and so forth. He says things like that just getting rid of corruption will save the country 10% of its budget, which he can use to build all these roads in Oaxaca or whatever. By being that vague and by being that charismatic, he's done two things. One, he's built himself an enormous coalition in Congress, most importantly. Well, maybe not most important, but that's actually where means that he'll have ostensibly greater ability to at least pass legislation. Implementing it is another matter. But secondly, he has this enormous amount of popular support. The challenges that Mexicans are facing are so enormous, are so deep-rooted, stuff like corruption. These are structural things that will take generations to fix. It's not something that he can just pass legislation, a new anti-corruption legislation, and get rid of it overnight. That's not how it works. Mexico's passed major anti-corruption legislation in 2008 and 2016, and they've had limited effects at best. So he'll have to pick his battles, basically. But by being so vague about all his policy pledges, he does have quite a bit of wiggle room to decide which ones to go and sort of adjust on the fly as he confronts reality. And that's sort of an advantage in the sense that individual leaders only have so much power, or only have so much freedom of action in which direction to go. They make pledges on the campaign trail, but then the underlying forces, the constraints of the office, push them in a certain direction. If he can channel his mass support and sort of harness his charisma in a way that toward a handful of things, he might actually be able to make some progress. That said, well, and the other thing, to his credit, when he was, he does have sort of a pragmatic streak in the past, and even an authoritarian streak when he felt like it was necessary. When he was mayor of Mexico City, he worked with elites, he worked with the business class, and he was credited with getting quite a bit done and improving the city quite a bit. He left office with sky high approval ratings, and so it will be fascinating to see how he sort of adjusts on the fly and navigates these realities that he's up against. But he's gonna have to pick his battles.
Yeah, and I would just to refer a little bit back to what Jacob said as well, and also touch on some of the ideas that Philip presented with a deeply ingrained problem with things like corruption and things like organized crime. Mexico, I would agree, there's some of the government institutions are weak. And that is one of the reasons why they have been having such a hard time solving some of their internal and domestic problems. And there are pockets that perhaps the government does not have as much control over as they would like. That is not something that is necessarily unique to Mexico. The concept exists in other countries, particularly ones that are very large in area. The degree to which perhaps there's a lack of control may vary. I mean, if you look at even Brazil, a country like Brazil, you've got favelas that are near major metropolitan areas or in actual cities where basically the government just doesn't have a presence. That would be an interesting conversation for a different day. But the one thing we have to bear in mind is that while there's all these problems, these are still economies with, over $1 trillion in GDP. They are still engaging in world affairs like major trade. This trade is with the United States, but there are companies that are still investing in Mexico. There is still production taking place in Mexico. It's become increasingly more difficult as it goes on, but I wouldn't go so far to say is that it's a dysfunctional country that doesn't really exist anymore and is hostage to all these domestic problems. I do think that they pose some severe impediments to it, but it's still functioning to a degree that it can generate this level of economic activity and support business and keep international business present in the country as well. That is being challenged, and that is a problem. And I'm not saying that they have all the solutions, but I wouldn't necessarily go quite as far with how some of that is portrayed.
I agree. I think people tend to think of all of Mexico as just being, Nuevo Laredo or Jalisco State, wherever the drug violence is highest, or just what they've seen when they go to Cancun and get ripped off by some cop. Those problems are everywhere. But Mexico is, especially in its urban cores, it's doing quite well. And it is a modern functioning place, a vibrant culture with really robust economies. And you see it if you kind of get past the borderlands.
I would push back a little bit here and just say, sure, Mexico has a large economy. It's one of the top 15 economies in the world, depending on what kind of metric you want to use. It engages in all of this international trade and business. The cartels are also a form of international trade and business. They have flourished inside of the Mexican economy. I'm sure somebody could write a very good doctorate one day about trying to calculate exactly what the GDP of the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartel and all of them put together would be as compared to the Mexican government. I grant that Mexico is a large country. It contains contradictions. I wrote something about this just this past week about how China is also a large country and contains contradictions. I've met Mexicans, not just normal everyday Mexicans, but Mexicans in government who view it as their great calling to try and reform the Mexican government, to make it more responsive to the people, to make it less corrupt. At the same time, I've met Western businessmen in the last 6 months who are talking about how they don't feel comfortable in Mexico anymore because it's unclear who's in control and who's in power and who they have to talk to in order to make sure that their investments are safe, or to make sure that the factories that they have there are not going to be touched by some of the violence around it. I'm not trying to paint a picture here of Mexico as a collapsed state. What I'm trying to say here is when you look at Obrador and you look at the things in front of him, obviously the situation in Mexico has gotten bad enough that the Mexican people have voted somebody basically outside of the spectrum before to come in and try and clean things up. And you can call that a populist, you can call that a radical, you can call that whatever words you want to use for that. But what you have here is you have an individual who has mostly been outside the system, who is coming into the system to clean it up. He's been elected with the mantle to clean it up, and he is promising to clean it up. And the hardest thing for a leader in that position is to not get transformed by all of the things that are around you. So Obrador might want to do all of these things, but he has a police network to work with and a system of economic elites to work with and a military to work with and a general class of people who may have been enriched by the drug trade, who are being enriched by corruption that will push back against him. And he is going to have to make impossible compromises to figure all this out. That's why when you talk about a populist is really only a populist until he gets elected or until she gets elected. The moment that a populist comes into office, or the moment that somebody comes into office with that kind of support, the walls start to come in around you. They start to mold you into a different thing. My favorite example of this is my favorite novel. It was written by Robert Penn Warren. It's called All the King's Men. It is loosely based on the life of Huey Long, who we would call probably a populist candidate. He's from Louisiana in the 1920s and the 1930s. And in that novel, you watch how this person gains a political following because he's willing to speak out against injustice and because he's willing to make all these changes. And by the time he gets assassinated by somebody who he's run afoul of, he is still fighting for some vision of what he thought was just and what he thought was true. But all the compromises he had to make to get there made him just as bad as the people that were before him, in some ways worse.
Wow, you went real highbrow on us. With Robert Pinwar, and I thought you were going to say like Tommy Carcetti from The Wire,
Yeah.
which it's kind of like my go-to.
Yeah, that's also a good one though.
I know he is. I mean, he was like anti-crime, pro-police until like all of a sudden he couldn't be because he had to make these compromises.
But yeah, I mean the point I made those comments about the current state of Mexico because I was responding to the question, well, what does Obrador need to do? And what Obrador needs to do, I mean, Mexico has all these priorities, and he's going to have to do some things for Mexico. Mexico is in some very difficult NAFTA relationships with the United States. It has some serious problems it has to deal with, not just with the drug trade, but with the increase of refugees that are coming from Central America up into Mexico to the United States. Not to mention all these other issues that we have to talk about. But for me, the most problematic thing for Obrador is he is an outsider coming into a system that has been rigged against him for a long time with a lot of different entrenched interests. And if Obrador cannot increase the power of Mexico's central government, he's going to fail, not in the same way that his predecessors failed, but he's going to fail because he's not going to be able to do that. He has to be able to use the power that he is getting from the people in order to create some kind of structure where he is able to transform Mexico, to try and move Mexico a different direction. And it's not something he can do alone. The drug trade doesn't stop in Mexico. Drugs flow through Mexico because Americans like drugs. So if Obrador wants to make progress here, he can do everything he wants with truth commissions and amnesties and this, that, or the other thing. If he doesn't have some kind of cooperative relationship with the United States to try and actually hit the problem where it is. But my point there is when I look at Mexico's greatest challenge and Obrador's greatest challenge, it is to try and make the Mexican presidency more than just somebody who's putting out a bunch of fires everywhere. Because right now, that's what the Mexican government does. It puts out fires. It tries to hold this thing together rather than deciding, we have a problem with the United States and NAFTA. We are going to move. We are going to, pursue a policy with the full strength of the Mexican people and the Mexican bureaucracy and Mexican economic elites to balance our relationship with the United States or with other countries in a better way.
I think a good parallel is what Rodrigo Duterte is doing in the Philippines. I mean, very similar situation in that the central government has never controlled all of the country. It's especially in the south and in the rural areas. It's always been beset by violence that's tied to drugs, that's tied to ideology, that's tied to, well, in Philippines' case, it's tied to religion as well. It's got bigger countries around it that the Philippines cannot determine its own fate. And so 2 years into his presidency so far, he's having some success, but the biggest challenges for him are the structural reforms that to really weed out corruption, to really weed out violence, to really pacify the South, require these just major surgery and just basically mired in the mud on all of them. But what's interesting about him is how he's still trying to find ways to channel popular support into actual change in governance. Is what the challenge that Jacob, what you were just talking about. Having 80% approval ratings, being elected on a landslide as this outsider, it only means so much until you can actually translate that into some kind of power over how the country operates. He's having some success. He's been able to build a much larger coalition as he's been in power. Other elites have sort of come alongside him and given him a little bit more political capital to shove into these major structural reforms. But it's a long shot at best.
Just to piggyback on what you're saying, Philip, to do these things, whether it's in the Philippines or whether it's in Mexico or whether it's in any other country, these things don't happen in a clean, neat way, right? It's not like somebody gets elected overnight and decides that he or she wants to get rid of corruption in Mexico or in the Philippines or wherever else they're from, and then they go about doing it and everybody agrees corruption should go away. In some ways, the fact that the Philippines, for example, has produced Duterte, or that Mexico has produced someone like Obrador and has chosen them as a leader, tells you that these are societies that are in flux. It goes back to what we were talking about, causality. What is a symptom and what is a cause, and how do you understand the rise of a leader outside of the mainstream coming into power? Perhaps the most hopeful thing you can take from what's going on in Mexico right now is that the society rejected what was going on before and said, this is not good. We want something different. And Obrador expresses a vision that we could actually all get along with, right? This is one that a majority of the Mexican population believes is in Mexico's best interest. If Obrador is a symptom of a move inside of Mexico to decide that, you know what, the way we've been doing things before, this just doesn't work for us anymore. This 100 years of these two parties and all of this corruption, et cetera, this just isn't going to work anymore. And we're willing to go through the chaos, the violence, the messiness of transforming the system to try and make this place better. Countries like the United States or like the United Kingdom or a country like France, where the rule of law is decently enshrined, it didn't just happen that way overnight. There was a lot of violence and a lot of competition for who was going to be able to control the reins of power before those countries created respect for the law. Respect for the law at the end of the day is to say that, and I use this phrase a lot, that the state has a monopoly on violence. In Mexico, the state doesn't have anything approaching a monopoly on violence. In some ways, you might even say the cartels can vie for a majority share of violence within inside of Mexico. So on the one hand, if Obrador is this expression of the Mexican people are fed up, Mexican people want a different country for themselves, then maybe this is the beginning of some long process out of which Mexico emerges as a more coherent country that is able to take advantage of its geopolitical resources and start to become a major player. On the other hand, this could just be, a vote of frustration. And the problems that Mexico has, it might be so deeply ingrained that this is just what Mexico is going to be forever. I don't think any of us will actually be around to see which direction it goes. As Philip said, this plays out on the time scale of generations. But when you look at someone like Obrador, it's a really fascinating moment because the question really is Mexico waking up? Is Mexico really changing? Or is this just some passing version of William Jennings Bryan who won't actually get anywhere and will fade off into the sunset, and Mexico will still be Mexico?
I think for AMLO to be successful, things will have to get a lot worse before they get better. I agree.
I'm really impressed how you started your response, Jacob, on a note of hope, and then ended with not very hopeful at all. It's kind of amazing how that works. And far be it from me to end this program on a note of hope, but there's a first time for everything in GPF podcast land, so we're going to do that. But before we go, I want to spend a little bit of time to discuss something a little bit shameless. We're going to talk about ourselves for a little bit. And as I usually do, I'm going to turn this over to Jacob. Jacob, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the new features that we've rolled out in the past couple weeks?
Okay, well, let me talk about some of these changes, and I'll do it without recourse to any basketball metaphors, because apparently listeners don't like it when I make basketball metaphors.
Yeah, readers and listeners hate it when they find out that we're not like one-dimensional people, that we actually enjoy things like books that are not about geopolitics, or these things called sports, which everybody in the world loves for the most part. Like, it's
for yourself. I only love geopolitics.
But no, we've made some changes. So the first thing is, we used to do one piece every day called the reality check. We no longer do one piece every day called the reality check. What we do instead is we put out what we're calling our Daily Memo. And the Daily Memo is basically us sifting through 24 hours worth of events, intelligence, hearsay, rumors that are happening in the world. And we try and deliver to our readers, instead of an 1,000-word tome on what the meaning of life is on a particular day. Every day we're trying to give you a set of, well, these are the most important issues. This is what we're looking at. And here are some things that are on our radar, some questions that we have to answer. That doesn't mean that we're writing less analysis. It actually means we're writing more, because now every time we pose a question to ourselves and we answer it, that's immediately publishing as a piece, rather than you have to waiting to the end of the week to read our material. We also are just simply being a little more reactive, and not just reactive to what's going on today, but also being a little bit broader in our topic selection. This allows us, when we're writing more than one thing a day, it allows you to cover multiple things in the world. We found that if you're writing one thing a day, it's very hard to make a case that the thing that is happening in China or Russia is less important than the thing that is happening in South America or in Central America. Now we have space to say, okay, if there are important things happening in two places, we're going to write about both of those things.
Well, it also allows us. It also allows us to be proactive in some cases. In fact, we were speaking about this just a moment ago, where we were kind of touching on Nicaragua and some of the unrest there well before some other outlets were, before they were paying attention to it. Which is not I'm not saying that to toot our own horn. I'm just saying that might not have happened under the old paradigm or our old regime, and it was allowed to happen in the new one. So.
No, exactly. And, the hope for this is that it allows us to expand our coverage. And we've also set up a new system of preferences so that if you don't want to have a deluge of articles throughout the entire day, you can just choose to receive all of them at one time. And you'll get it in kind of one nice, clean email so you can look at everything that GPF has said in one day. Or if you want everything in real time, you can just get everything in real time. The second major thing that we've done is we have introduced something called the forecast tracker. The goal of this is to really bring us back to what is our most important, I guess you could call it, our most important endeavor, which is forecasting. So we write a forecast at the beginning of each year. We also have a long-term forecast that we're going to be installing a tracker on fairly soon. And what we've been doing throughout the course of the year is that maybe halfway through the year, we check in and we give ourselves a report card, or we refer back to a forecast in whatever piece we're writing at a given time. We felt like that was limiting. We felt like, on the one hand, it made us ignore the forecast. And on the other hand, we were trying to shoehorn the forecast into things that they didn't necessarily have to be shoehorned into. So now what we're doing is once every 2 weeks, we're taking a step back and we're looking at how events in the world in those past 2 weeks play with some of the things that we predicted at the beginning of the year. The first installment went out 2 weeks ago. I believe this podcast will publish tomorrow, which will be Friday. So we will actually publish the second version of the forecast tracker tomorrow. But in general, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to try and give our readers a sense of the fact that we don't really care about who wins what election or what happens in the world. Those are all personal opinions. And if you ever meet any one of us, you can have a drink with us and we'll tell you what we think. When it comes to our writing, when it comes to what we express in our publication with our method, all of these various things, we care about being accurate. We care about being right. And rather just insisting to you that we're objective and you should believe us, the forecast tracker is really meant to be, okay, here's us judging ourselves. Here's what we got wrong. Here's what we got correct. And here are the things that we didn't even see coming at all. And that way, hopefully our readers not only get a better sense of our internal process and of what we're seeing in the world, but also hopefully you get a sense of what's really driving our analysis, which is where we think the world is going, not necessarily how we want the world to be, which are different things.
Well, and to that, I would only add, coming from my perspective as managing editor, the forecast tracker really brings home another aspect of our content, which admittedly is lost along the way, and we don't always convey to our readers as well as we possibly could, which is that we don't just write about stuff that happens in the world. I mean, we do, but there's a point to it, right? Everything that we publish is written because it either comports with or deviates from our forecast, right? So we aren't just like picking these things at random, and we're not just like chasing little butterflies over here. Like these, even if we don't communicate it very well, and I admit that's a failure on my part to some degree or another, the forecast tracker and the forecast helps bring that home. It's like these are the things that we chose to write about these. So all the little things that you see in the forecast tracker, many of them will have been separate pieces already published. And so it really, I think it just kind of like weaves our content better together a little bit better. All right, Jacob, thank you very much. Philip, Allison, thanks so much for joining us. Do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners?
I'd like to talk about Carmelo Anthony going to the Rockets.
That's very nice of you. You want to take the hate mail away from me for talking about basketball.
All right, well, thanks a lot, guys.